of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. Until the summit of enlightenment is reached, I and all beings go for refuge to the sources of true refuge. I will not practice the absorption of calm abiding in order to release all beings from their particular suffering and establish them in lasting peace and happiness. By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. So a short introduction. For many years, people from our center here have traveled to India on an annual basis to participate in Boka Rinpoche's Mahamudra program. And one of the many delightful things about traveling to India has been a growing, kind of emerging international Sangha. So people came from many countries for those seminars. And this evening, we are delighted to welcome two of the most delightful people at those seminars, Tenzin Tulku and his wife. God, I've drawn the wrong name out of my old brain. Emmanuel. And so they're both here with us this evening, and this comes about by virtue of, I believe, Bill and Dora seeing them this year in India, no, last year, but towards the end of last year, and having a little meeting and discovering that they were going to be in San Francisco in this month anyway, and so they agreed to come up and visit with us, and as a result, we're all here this evening due to the truth of interdependence. And so I don't want to take any more time than that, except to say welcome. Again, it's so nice to see both of you here on this occasion, and you will find shortly that he's actually quite good at telling his own stories. Real stories. I want to check and see if everyone can hear that.
Can everyone hear me, or?
Yeah.
How about maybe point it a little bit? Is that better? I may have to lean over like this. Yeah, hold on. Here. There. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think everyone can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Sounds good.
If I say something and you can't hear me, or there's a confusion, just let me know. Just stop me wherever I am, and because I'll just ramble away otherwise. So, well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming here tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people, and thank you, Michael and Bill and Dora as well. Indeed, it was in India in end of October, beginning of November of last year that all of this started to happen, and it was, I don't know if it was more of as much as an invitation as it was perhaps us saying we would really like to visit the center. And so not to downplay their role in this happening, but I think it was more of a self-centered wish than or desire rather than anything else. But they seemed very happy to entertain that. In any case, it's happened, and we're very happy. And it's true that we were in San Francisco just yesterday and the day before, so everything sort of coincided nicely for this. But I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share my experience with all of you. And if like I said, I'm used to teaching in a classroom, and so if you have questions, I'm used to being stopped. So that's fine if you do have questions. So yeah, I'm starting to think now that I for some reason what I had meant to talk about has now gone out of my head all of a sudden. But is there anyone here who is unfamiliar with the term tulku? Okay, 2, 3, yeah. Pardon? Okay, you don't know 100%. How much? What percentage do you know? Is it 5 or?
I think it may be something like a lama.
Well, the term tulku, the term itself, if you break it down, means emanation body. So it's a physical manifestation. Technically speaking, it's a physical manifestation of an enlightened being. So, for example, Buddha Shakyamuni, as a quote unquote human, in his human form, that form is a physical manifestation. So that physical form is a tulku. The term in Sanskrit goes back to Nirmanakaya, and that we won't get into that too much because it gets a little bit complicated. But yeah, it's a physical manifestation of the principle of enlightenment. That's the idea behind the term. It's also a title given to those who are said to have reincarnated from one life to the next, not just taking rebirth, but actually having some sort of a say in the matter, so to speak. The idea behind this is that certain persons, having practiced and meditated and very much cultivated their minds, come to a point where they can choose to reincarnate, and they choose the circumstances and the conditions of how they come back the next life. Now, there's this means that when you think of cyclic existence with 6 realms, and you think of karma, the 6 realms does everyone know the 6 realms of cyclic existence or not? 6 realms of cyclic existence, basically, in a nutshell. There's let's see, animals. How do you put it? They're often called hungry and thirsty ghosts, but that's not very. I don't think the term is quite appropriate, but in any case, we'll call them that for now. Also called pretas. There's certain hell realms. And then there's the realm of humans, there's the realm of demigods and gods. And the idea in Buddhism is that we as humans have a very privileged existence. We have the capacity we have the possibility of suffering, and that may sound quite strange to think that, that the fact that we have the possibility of suffering is a good thing, but we have the possibility of suffering, or of I was going to say unwell being, It's a sense that of unease, um, possible suffering, even. And suffering. When I use the term suffering, we have to be careful of this term. Suffering doesn't necessarily mean a physical suffering. It can mean physical suffering. It can also mean psychological suffering, but it can also mean just the stress that comes from just the stress or the unease that comes from the passage of time and being attached to certain things. So let's say you have an animal, a pet, and as you have this pet for a certain amount of time, and as the pet starts to grow old, you see the slow deterioration of the pet and the diminishing of the pet's vitality. And you're attached to this pet, and so there's a certain uneasy feeling, and that uneasy feeling is a form of suffering, and it comes from the passage of time and our attachment to things, to people, to objects, all sorts of things, really. So there's that aspect of it, and it can also mean just angst or anxiety. The term we call suffering in Buddhism, the term in Sanskrit is dukkha, and dukkha translates really in many different ways. So it can mean angst, it can mean stress, it can mean just an uneasy feeling, but it can also mean real, tangible, physical suffering. So this is all, brought into one. But to get back to what I was saying, is that we have the possibility of experiencing dukkha, of experiencing this form of, we'll call it suffering for now. It's a sort of generic term that's being used. And we also have the possibility of realizing, understanding that we're suffering, or that we're going through this, we're experiencing this, and the possibility of searching out means to remedy the situation. And this isn't given, these elements aren't given to just everybody. So animals don't necessarily have, in the Buddhist tradition, animals don't necessarily have the possibility of trying to get out of this type of, this experience of dukkha. And they don't necessarily have the understanding that by doing certain things that come to them naturally, they're actually creating more. And the gods, for example, what they call the gods have this incredible lifespan, and the description of the god realms is just incredibly wondrous. And there's this idea that the gods don't need lights in their houses, well, in their palaces, we'll put it. They don't need lights because their body naturally emits this luminosity, and so they don't need anything, and they hear wonderful, beautiful music all the time, and all the scents are just wondrous to experience, and so on and so forth. And so they don't realize that time is slowly passing away. And then, as they get to the end of their time in the God realms, they start to experience anxiety and stress about what's going to happen next. So their suffering is a form of ignorance of suffering. It's the suffering of the passage of time, but the ignorance of that passage of time. So as humans, we actually have the capacity we have all of these possibilities, but we also have a little thing called karma, and with karma, we're constantly acting, and we're constantly acting, and at this point, we're actually constantly reacting. So something happens, and we forget that we're the ones who have produced everything for this event to take place. And then we can get angry. We can feel all sorts of emotions within the context of this one event, and then we react on that emotion, react on that on out of anger or out of frustration, which in the end is just creating more possibilities for future anger, future frustration, and we're creating habitual tendencies. So just as meditation is a means of training the mind, getting it used to doing things a different way, or to not necessarily do the same things we do, we have a tendency to continue to always repeat our actions and to over and over again do things that keep us stuck in psychic existence and going around and around and around. For most of us, our karma seems to dictate where we're going, what's going to happen next. So when we die, we're led along certain paths by our karma. So the accumulation of sort of the potential of that. Let's see, the results of previous acts in a state of potentiality. So when it comes to when the result of whatever action we've completed in the past actually comes to fruition, that's what we experience as being our karma. And so when we pass away, when we die, whatever we've done in our past, in this life and the lives before, will influence the direction that we're going to go, and it also influences the way we experience death and the way we experience what comes after. And so it's sort of like being led, or sort of propulsed by our own actions without realizing it. And the idea with tulkus is that they actually have the possibility, they have the capacity to, through a certain clarity of mind, come about through their practice, that they're able to choose and to direct their own rebirths. So for the most of us, we're just reborn wherever our karma dictates. But for tulkus, this is the ideal. This is the sort of theoretical side of it, is that tulkus are supposedly able to choose where they're reincarnated. And just a footnote here is that I don't claim to be able to choose that, and I don't claim to have ever chosen. But that's the idea behind this. One of the capacities of certain teachers that can do this. And they choose to be reborn in places and in circumstances, situations that will allow them to develop a certain type of activity. And that activity is basically to help other beings, other sentient beings, to really to help them experience in a durable way true happiness. And if you look at what is true happiness from a Buddhist perspective, true happiness comes with enlightenment and with realization. And so that's the idea. That's the idea, is that these beings, these people, practice, they meditate, they cultivate their minds, and they then choose. They come to a point where they choose to reincarnate in certain situations so as to be able to better help other sentient beings on the path to enlightenment. There's the way this happens is because they have this motivation, this one motivation, and that's compassion and loving kindness. Compassion and loving kindness, which are kind of two sides of the same coin. It's just two ways of describing a similar sentiment. They're motivated through their compassion to take birth in cyclic existence. Well, this what's implicit in that statement is that they actually have the capacity to exit cyclic existence, which means that they get to a certain point just before enlightenment, and then they say, okay, I'm going to hold off. I'm going to withhold my own enlightenment so that I can help others. There's the idea that, for one, that they can hold off, but there are different types. These beings are called bodhisattvas, and, perfectly altruistic heroes, heroes of enlightenment. That's the Tibetan term, Changju Senpa. Actually, that's what it means: heroes for enlightenment, or heroes of enlightenment. So they set aside their own enlightenment to privilege the enlightenment of other beings. That's the theoretical side. As I said, Tulku is also a title. So Tulku is sort of an honorific title that's given to beings, to people who have been recognized by certain masters as being the reincarnations of other masters of the past, so other Buddhist masters. And you find a lot of people who carry the title Tulku, but who don't necessarily correspond to the ideal of what a Tulku is meant to be. So either a bodhisattva or an enlightened being. So yeah, most of us carry the title, and but aren't necessarily. We may be striving towards helping others and doing our best, but we're not necessarily there yet. So yes.
Are you saying that there would be some ones that chose to come back? Do they then remember in this life that they did that, or?
Do the ones who have chosen to come back actually remember that they've chosen to come back?
Yeah.
I think that, I think it would be safe to say that that those who are actual enlightened beings who have chosen to manifest or to be born in certain situations, they would know. Whether or not they'll say it is another story. But there are beings like that. I think that the shrine is kind of full of them. So there are many beings. There are beings like this who have chosen very, very clearly, at least in my opinion. For me, they've definitely chosen to be born so that in certain situations, certain circumstances, so that they can really help elevate our own consciousness, our minds, so that we can evolve. Now, if you ask them, do you remember making that vow? They'll probably say no. But to ask them that question is almost unimportant, because the fact is that they're here and they're actually doing this, and so because they're doing this, then it obviously they did make that vow, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do this. I feel like I'm kind of going around in circles on that one, but I hope everyone understands what I'm saying here. So Tulku is it's a title, but it's also an ideal, and it's attached to different notions. It's attached to notions of enlightenment, notion of compassion, the ideal of a bodhisattva. And those who carry the title, like myself, those who carry the title were for the most part educated to try to emulate the compassionate bodhisattva, and to try to work where we're expected, really, to try to work towards the benefit, the well-being of other sentient beings. that training often happens in a monastery, but not only. I mean, for the most part, it happens in a monastery. And this system of recognizing the reincarnations of past teachers goes back to about the 12th century in Tibet. Perhaps even further, actually, to there are records that mention people being reincarnated already in the 11th century. But as an institution, it really starts with the second Karmapa stating clearly that he is the reincarnation, that he was the reincarnation of the first Karmapa, and therefore sort of, well, I think he stated it relatively late in his life, but just the fact that he stated that, and then there's the whole succession through reincarnation starts to take place in Tibet, and spreads quite rapidly, actually, throughout all the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. There was some reticence in the beginning of adopting this method of succession. So what it means is that originally you would have either, let's say I have a monastery, I have a monastic community or a religious spiritual community, and a certain degree of perhaps wealth as well. And I am going to pass away, and so I designate someone that I'm going to give this to, and someone who's going to take my place as the leader of this community. That can be done during the spiritual leader's lifetime, or sometimes it happens afterwards, and then there can be a little bit of a discussion of who the community should go to, and so on and so forth. In the Sakya tradition, which is, there in four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Nyingma being the oldest, that's what Nyingma means, old, so old school. And then there's Sakya and Gagyu, came about roughly about the same time. Sakya means great earth, and it's because of the place that it's a monastery called Sakya, in a place called Sakya because the earth there is gray. So Great Earth School. And then the Gagyu tradition, which you all know, or most of you know, because you're here. So we're in a center that's part of the Gagyu tradition. And then the latest school of Tibetan Buddhism to come about is the Gelugpa school, which is around 1409. So there were teachers in the Sakya school. Some would call it an outgoing religious figure. An outgoing religious figure, not meaning that he goes out and has a good time. An outgoing religious figure who's leaving, or who's going to, well, basically is at the end of his life. His position will pass often. Well, at the beginning, it passed to his son, and then later on, when they became actual religious figures with vows and everything, vows of celibacy, then it passed often to the nephew. So it was from uncle to nephew, and so the nephew would take over the religious community of his uncle, and so on and so forth, and it remained in families for a very, very long time, and then you have the system of reincarnation, which just opened up possibilities quite a bit, because suddenly you can choose whoever you want, though the person couldn't necessarily be found during your lifetime. So the successor would be found later on. Now that entails a search committee and all sorts of divinations and divination search committee, and even looking for certain particular specific auspicious signs. But what the Tulku system did, what this system of succession through reincarnation did, was it allowed them to choose specific persons in specific regions and specific families and bring them into the fold. So that means, for example, in Europe, in Europe in the Middle Ages, there was, and Renaissance period and all that, a king would marry his daughter to another monarch or another family, and that family would become attached to that king's power and kingdom. And so it was a means of also growing your sphere of sort of political activity. Similar to this, with the reincarnation system, you could, if a master reincarnated into a specific region or a specific family, then that family became affiliated with that master's school and that master's monastery. And so a region could be almost annexed in some ways, I guess you could say, and brought into the fold. This is one of the things that came about with the system of reincarnation. I always say you have to be careful about speaking about this in this way, because it ignores the whole spiritual side of it, and it talks only about power and financial concerns. So because basically the successor inherits everything that the master had. So if he had a monastery, or even 50 monasteries, and with the monasteries came land, and with land means wealth, and all of this is given or inherited by the master's successor. So sort of a means of controlling who gets the wealth and how that can continue. But if you speak of this only in these terms, then it neglects an entire and very important side of reincarnation, which is the whole, what I spoke of in the beginning, what reincarnation is supposed to be, and what a tulku is supposed to mean, and the idea that a master develops this strong compassion, and through that strong compassion and loving kindness for other beings, decides to continue his or her stay and to remain in cyclic existence until the metaphor is until the last blade of grass has been enlightened. So that's a lot of blades of grass. So the idea is that there shouldn't, a bodhisattva takes the vow to not enlighten, so not to hold off his or her own enlightenment until cyclic existence is emptied of sentient beings completely, so that all sentient beings are established in enlightenment, in enlightened state. It's a big job. But that's what the bodhisattva vow really is. So we talk about taking the bodhisattva vow and wanting to have compassion for others and to feel loving kindness and develop these things. But it's an important part of it is to know what you're getting yourself into. To realize that it's not just for a certain select few. I'm not doing this just for some friends. Everyone, including those considered my enemies, have to be seen as my friends in that case. So it's really important. It's an important aspect of it. And by saying that it's just a financial institution, that it's just a political, it's just political maneuvering, really ignores that whole side of it. It also ignores the fact that there are reincarnations or tulkus of masters who never had spiritual communities who never had great wealth. In fact, my predecessor fled power. He ran away from it. He always avoided it, and he had next to nothing. Someone gave me a photograph of him, and in that photo, it's just him. He's sitting in meditation, because that was apparently the only time anyone could sneak up on him to take pictures, because he never wanted his picture taken. But he's in meditation, and he's just sitting there, and in front of him is a bowl that's used for eating, drinking, and everything, and a rosary, a mala, and that's it. And those were pretty much his possessions. And apparently he had a few other things as well, but he was far from being any kind of wealthy, landowning or monastery or community owning, if you can call it that, figure. Yet I was recognized as his reincarnation. And so that means that the financial, political aspect of it is completely absent, but the spiritual aspect is very present. So these are things that have to be taken into account. The reason I was in San Francisco for these past few days was because I was attending a conference about the Tulku system in Tibet. And oddly enough, I was the only Tulku there, or at least the only recognized Tulku there. I know someone who was there who would argue very much with me that he's a Tulku and just was never recognized, but never officially recognized. No, it's just sort of funny how that happened. But during the 1.5 days of conference, which was extremely interesting and a wonderful exchange, and I really enjoyed it quite a bit. But I couldn't help but come to this, over and over again, thinking, yes, but there's so much more to it. Every time there was a description of the Tulku system and trying to sort of get a grasp of the Tulku system, it kept sort of coming up short somewhere. And I kept having this image of, there's this Buddhist image of these blind men touching an elephant in different places and trying to describe the elephant. And that's what it seemed like. It was as though we were all trying to describe an elephant, but we were all blind men trying to describe part of the elephant and not really getting the overarching picture. And at the same time, it's very difficult to try to understand what a tulku is. I'm still trying to understand myself. I think that's why I appreciate the conference so much, is that it makes me reflect really on, well, what does it mean to be a tulku? What is it? What does it mean for me? And on top of it all, I'm a Westerner recognized as a tulku. Now, I'm a rarity, in a system that's already, full of rare people. So it's odd, and thinking about it, saying, okay, well, what does it mean to be a Westerner? Who gets to be a Westerner? What does it mean? And even the notion of West, East itself is kind of flawed because it's neglecting North and South. So, there are Caucasian tulkus, but there are also tulkus that aren't Caucasian, and so you can't use the term Caucasian. It doesn't really quite sit right. So there's issues like that, but in recent times, this is something that I've sort of come to start wondering: is what does it mean to be a tulku, and what does it mean for me to be a tulku? What does it mean to me? And I come back to this traditional understanding of what a tulku is, and that is someone who has the motivation to really try to do something to be of benefit to other sentient beings, And that's maybe part of my upbringing, part of my training as a Tulku. But at the same time, it's also part of who I am, and that's something that I try to continue to do, even though, I'm just sort of in a very early stage of on this path as well. There's a question.
Yeah, you're probably asked these questions all the time, but when were you recognized as a Tulku, and who is this person or this being that you were reincarnated as or through?
I was recognized when I was 8 years old. So the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, came to Montreal. This is where I'm from. Came to Montreal and recognized me as a reincarnation. The story goes back further. It basically, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, a teacher, an ex-abbot of one of the major Gelugpa monasteries from Tibet, that had relocated to India, he came to Montreal to visit another teacher who was there, a friend. And he came. My parents were running a Dharma center at the time, and they were students of Kalu Rinpoche. So they were running a Dharma center, and they invited him because it was a Rinme center, so non-sectarian and just so they invited him over, and he gave a bit of a talk, and then he had lunch, and he left, and he left. My father went to bring him back to where he was staying, and I was small, so it was nap time. And so my mother put me in bed for a nap, and I asked her, so who was he? And she told me, well, he's the teacher of this other teacher who was living in Montreal, and he's called a geshe, and yeah, so he's his teacher, he's his geshe. And I told her at that time, I have a geshe too, and my geshe's name is Geshe Konoa, and he lives in such and such a place, and I described the area, the place he lived in, and with mountains, and high mountains, and the house, the area, and then I said, and I also have some friends, and mentioned one friend whose name I remember very vividly is Geshe Nyanye, and I said, I have there's a protector too. There's a protector deity, and that protector is a horse with wings. And so I used to talk. I was talking about that, talking like this to my mother, and she thought, "Oh, how cute." I was 3 or 4, and she thought, "Oh, how cute." He's obviously been touched by this teacher, and he just really obviously likes him, and and so he's making up really neat stories, and she she thought it was just cute, and she wrote it down so she could tell my father afterwards, and all that. And what happened is, in the meantime, this teacher had left his glasses at our house, and he was going to be leaving to India soon, and so he needed his glasses. So, but he was staying at the opposite end of Montreal at the time. So it was about half an hour drive from where we were living, and so my father came back home to pick up the glasses and go and bring them there. And while he was at home, he was talking with my mom, who was probably cleaning up or something, taking a few moments of respite from 3 kids, so it was a bit of a boisterous time, and so she said, oh, he said, this is what our son said. When he left, he obviously really liked this teacher because he said this and he said that, and my dad said, oh, how cute. And then went back with the glasses, brought this teacher the glasses, and when he met with the teacher, he said, oh, by the way, I just wanted to let you know that our son really liked you, really liked meeting you, and you've really left quite a bit of an impression on him, because once you left, he said that he also had a geshe and that his name was Geshe Konowa, and the teacher said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, he said that he lives in a place like this, and that he has a protector that's a horse with wings, and and the teacher said, "Well, I know these people. These are names that I'm familiar with. So, no ordinary child says things like this. So I would really like to see him again." So my father got in his car, came all the way back home, picked me up, kind of picked everyone up, and brought us back there. And the teacher asked me what I had said, and so I told him. I said, "I have a geshe, and his name is Geshe Konoa, and I have friends. One of them is named Geshe Nyanye, and I have a protector, and that protector is a horse with wings, and so on and so forth." And he was, I think, at once overjoyed and kind of maybe shaken at the same time, because I was pretty much one of the first Westerners to have this experience, to actually really talk about memories that that turned out to be memories of my previous life, and so he went back to India shortly thereafter, and for me, all of this was coming out in dreams. So it kept coming out in dreams every night. I would have even in nap time it would come out. Well, perhaps not every night, but it often came out. And my older sister was very skeptical about it, the whole thing. My younger sister was kind of just along for the ride. She was a little bit too little to make heads or tails of it. But in any case, about 4 years later, we received 3 letters, really. One letter was from this particular teacher, saying that he had consulted with the Dalai Lama. He had consulted the state oracle, and he had done quite a bit of research, and that they had found that I was the reincarnation. That I was a reincarnation. I was a Tulku. And he said more information was going to follow from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so the second letter that we got was from His Holiness the Dalai Lama's office, well, it was from His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself, explaining that I was recognized as the reincarnation of a very specific teacher whose name was Geshe Jatse. And, all of this, sort of what it entailed in some ways, that it was just an ordinary child, and so it was important to take care and beware of certain things. And then a third letter came, and that third letter was from a monastery in India that we had never heard of, saying to my parents, "Your son has been recognized as the reincarnation of one of our teachers. Please send him back to us now." Tibetan tact. So, of course, my parents' first reaction was, "Who are you?" And their second reaction was, "Well, what do we do?" Because they were relatively, new to Buddhism. They'd only been Buddhist for 8-9 years. So relatively new to Buddhism, and Buddhism, when you get involved in Buddhism, you think, "Oh yes, reincarnation, lovely, I believe in reincarnation." But when it happens to you, I always wanted to make a T-shirt, "Reincarnation happens." When reincarnation suddenly goes from being a theory to being something practical, it's very jolting to many people, and so they're quite torn between, well, what do we do? Should we, as parents, we want to, preserve our child and protect our child and not send our child off to a monastery in India. especially to live with people we've never met, and we don't know what's going to happen. And India, it was such a faraway, exotic place, and so they really didn't know what to do. But at the same time, and at the same time, they wanted to be good Buddhists because they realized that, well, as a tulku, I'm going to need an education, a certain type of education, and that certain type of education is not necessarily readily available in the West. And believe me, they tried. They tried to find a situation that would accommodate me, so that I could really develop into a proper tulku. But they tried and tried, and it was just impossible to find something. It was either that I was uneasy with being there, or the monastery would put pressure on the people that I was with, and it became a hindrance. Even Galu Rinpoche, the previous Galu Rinpoche, who really took me under his wing, and it's one heck of a wing to be under. But he really he had great concern for me, and tried to find situations in which I could really develop my potential as a reincarnation, and even he received occasionally nasty letters from the monastery saying, "You're trying to steal our reincarnation," because with tulkus comes prestige, and so here they are once again. It's this notion of prestige and status, and so that whole side comes into it as well. So. Once again, you can't really neglect either side of it. These are different facets of the same, well, perhaps the same jewel. But so my parents at that point were very, really trying to find some sort of situation for me to not be too far from home. Yet where I could receive this education that was obviously very necessary. And they at one point they were wondering, should we should send him to India, but and then they had the wonderful idea of actually asking my opinion. Which I don't know. I don't know many parents at that time who would have asked their 8-year-old child, "Well, what do you want to do in such a situation?" Because it really requires a certain level of maturity on the part of the child to project him or herself into that kind of situation, and quite a bit of abstract thinking, really. But my mother came. I remember still. My mother came to see me, and she said, "Well, look, because they had been talking and talking and talking, and were really at an impasse." And they came to see me, and they said, "Well," my mother came, and she said, "Well, so what do you want to do? What do you think about the situation?" And I looked at her and I said, "I'll have to go one day, because I can't resist my karma. But right now is not the time." And then I probably went back to playing or something like that. But this whole thing of not being able to resist my karma was very important. And but they really did respect the fact that I had said I'm not ready to go yet. And for that I'm forever grateful. That they did respect that. Despite the fact that it was very difficult because the pressure kept mounting from the monastery to send me over there. And the letters kept getting more and more adamant and more perhaps graphic is the word about what could happen if I don't go to the monastery, and what if I have an accident, and then they'll be responsible for me not receiving the education, and so on and so forth. So but yeah, so that was when I was 8, and the decision was actually confirmed with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because they asked me. So they had asked me. I said, "I'm not ready yet. I don't think it's the time to go." And then we met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he said, "No, it's not the time yet. And he said, it's not the right time, wait a little bit. And very shortly after that, a tuberculosis epidemic broke out of the monastery. So indeed, it wasn't the time. And yeah, also I developed asthma at 8 years old, so I would have really suffered from tuberculosis, with the tuberculosis epidemic. It would have been a very difficult moment. So, I was trying to find situations where I could learn Tibetan and learn Dharma and study and so on and so forth, and while still going to school. And eventually, the decision was made that when I was 12, that I was supposed to I would go to the monastery and would do an enthronement ceremony and sort of start that whole education finally. And just shortly prior to our departure, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi at the time, was assassinated. So that put a damper on things. We couldn't go, but instead we went to France, and Gala Rinpoche was there once again, and Gala Rinpoche once again took me under his wing and said, well, he can stay at this temple here in Paris that we've just inaugurated. So I spent a year and a bit in Paris, not studying Tibetan, or trying to study, but not really getting very far. And I learned French really quickly, though. So I studied there and started to sort of get some sort of an education, but it was never quite right. And the monastery kept sending letters saying, "Hey, why don't you send them to us? Come on." Eventually, when I was 14. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, I think now was the time for him to go. And Gala Rinpoche also did a mo and did a divination and said, it's time. Jamgon Kondro Rinpoche, the previous Jamgon Kondro Rinpoche, also did a mo and said, I think it's time to go. And so at 14 years old, I packed up and made a very significant move to India. And that's where I began what would become 6 years of study at a monastery in South India. It was it was a very important moment in my life. And then 6 years later, I decided to leave the monastery and come back to the West because I felt that I had something more to do. And that I wanted to engage. This is really what I felt, is that I wanted to engage more in, with the people that I felt I had, I was karmically connected to, I suppose. I felt that I was born in the West. I was reborn in the West for a reason, and must be so that I can exchange more and help do something, at least to be of benefit to people in the West. And so I decided to leave. I just realized this was extremely large digression from the original question, but the second part of the question was, what is it, or if I'm not mistaken, it was sort of what is it, or who is this, or was this person? Technically speaking, that person was me, but just in another form. Or it's historically speaking, I guess you could say. The person that I'm a reincarnation of, his name was Geshe Jetse. He was a scholar from a monastery called Sera Monastery in Lhasa. And after he finished, but particularly once he finished his dialectical studies, so his philosophical education, accumulating in what's called a Geshe degree. So it's sort of giving, so it's like a PhD in some ways. Once he finished that, he left the monastery and went into solitary retreat. He was known for practice. He really wanted to practice all the time. And so he left the monastery and went into solitary retreat, but a bunch of his students kept coming for teachings. And that was, he felt, a little bit disruptive. And so he decided to move from the original hermitage that he was staying in to a hermitage much higher up on the mountain behind Sara Monastery that takes about a day to get to. And yet his students still followed. And so he decided to move further away. And he moved to a small area that is a small temple monastery has since, I think, become a nunnery. 3 valleys behind Sara. And they still came. And so he decided to leave completely the area and went to another place called Ökachulung, which is a beautiful region, sort of, yeah, I guess sort of a little bit south of Lhasa. Rolling hills, and valleys and streams and rushing rivers and all this. And the founder of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism lived there for quite some time. The king of that region used to be a strong supporter of all the Buddhist schools. And so all the Buddhist schools came together at this place. And so Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa tradition, had spent quite a bit of time there and in meditation and retreat in a small cave. And my predecessor, Geshe Tadse, went and meditated in that cave, and that's where he died in around 1956 or so. So historically speaking, that's who I was, and it's part of who I am. And so that's how these memories that I had were from that life. I could access them because they were mine. So it's a sort of continuum. There was one question here, and then there's another question there.
I was just wondering, I've heard that a person or different aspects of a teacher can reincarnate. So not just one person could reincarnate, be a tulku from a previous teacher.
Yep.
And so I was curious about that, but also what exactly reincarnates? It's not like you look like that teacher. Or
Actually, I do.
do you?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. There are physical traits, and they're not all tulkus look like their predecessors, but there are a number of tulkus who carry signs, birthmarks. There's one tulku in, I believe, Ganden monastery, another Gelugpa monastery that I met when I was living in India, and every reincarnation in his lineage, I think he was probably 12th or something in that lineage, perhaps even more, but all of them have a birthmark on the sole of one of their feet, one foot in particular. And the story behind it is that the original teacher, they were saying, well, how are we going to find you when you come back? How are we going to find your reincarnation? He said, easy. And he took a pen and he put a little dot on his foot, and he said, an ink dot on his foot, and he said, all my reincarnations will have this mark. And same foot, same reincarnation. And in my case, I had been told ever since I was recognized, really, everyone who knew my predecessor has told me from here upwards I look the same. And then in 1999 I met his family, the nieces and nephews of my predecessor, and it's not just from here. We have the same chin, so we have the same chin. So there in Buddhism, that even your physical appearance can very much be tied to your previous life's physical appearance. If you consider that everything is a manifestation of the mind, then that makes perfect sense. If you don't consider that, then it's just a really cool coincidence. But to answer the question, what reincarnates? Basically, it's the consciousness. It's a very subtle consciousness that is moving and changing continuously. And as it goes from one instant to the next, just like it goes from one instant to the next, we have this idea that there's life, and then there's death, and there's big thing, and then there's life again. But really, it's just a change. It's sort of like from every instant. Everything, our whole body is changing and regenerating, and our mind is the same way. Our consciousness is evolving, it's developing, it's changing. We're creating new habits. We can elevate our consciousness really to become better beings, and we can become, sort of achieve realization. I suppose you could argue that realization is actually already there. We just don't understand. We just don't realize it yet. Which is a funny phrase, actually. Realization is there. We just don't realize that realization is there. But it's really real. The realization is real. But yeah, there's a sort of consciousness continuum. So from one instant to the next, the consciousness is carried forth. And someone asked me this question earlier on today, and I gave a metaphor of taking a series of candles, and you take from one candle, you light the next candle, and from that candle you light the next one, and then so on and so forth until perhaps 20 candles. The flame from the first candle is different from the flame on every other candle, yet the source is the same. There's something that's carried forth, but each flame, each candle flame is actually something different. And then at the same time, each flame, if you think of a flame, what is a flame? It's something that's consuming something else. So the wick is being consumed. The wax, or the paraffin, whatever it is, is being consumed. And so it's changing. Itself is changing. And so there's something that carries forth from one instant to the next. Otherwise, we would have no memory. But there's something that's carried forth from one instant to the next. We see it as some continuous line. If you take another metaphor analogy that I use is if you draw a line with a pen or with a pencil or whatever, you draw a line on a long line, and it seems just one straight line. But if you look at it closely, very closely, the line is actually made up of tiny little dots. So like if you look at a poster, from afar, it looks, everything looks fine. But when you get really close to it, it's just a series of little dots, colored dots. So that line that seems continuous is a series of little tiny dots. But because we're so far away from it, it seems as though it's one continuous line. But really, there's an interruption between the dots. And so it's kind of the same thing with consciousness. With this consciousness, it's just always moving, always changing, and from one instant to the next, it's coming into being and disappearing, and then coming into being and disappearing, sort of changing like this. But we see it as something continuous, when really it's something that's forever changing, always changing, and continuously different. So I hope that answers the question. And yes, there was a yes, and then sorry.
As a Tulku, did you find your studies in Buddhism familiar and easy?
Easy, maybe not is not the right choice of word, perhaps, but easier perhaps than most. And yes, there was a familiarity. It took me 9 months to learn Tibetan fluently. So I was very quick picking up Tibetan. And then debate seemed very natural to me. So it was in a context at Sarah, that's what the scholars do, is they debate. And so debate came very naturally to me. I felt very at home being at the monastery, and especially being in debate. And there were certain topics that came much more naturally to me than others. I also knew one or two prayers, texts by heart without having ever read them. So that happened as well. So there was a familiarity, definitely. And there was a certain facility or ease in learning that I had, a sort of natural propensity to this, which is really one of the characteristic traits of what a tulku is expected to have. A little interesting anecdote is that at the end of 5 years of study at Sarah Monastery, usually it's the end of 5 years of study of any Gelugpa monastery, you undergo an exam called the Rikchung exam. And this Rikchung exam is a debate exam, so you're up. There are 16 candidates from each class in that year, from one class. So take the exam, and so they take the exam, and one candidate asks questions in front of the entire monastery, and another candidate answers the questions. And so the person answering the question can only answer yes or no. So it's complex, it's difficult, and you can very easily be sort of tricked into saying things you don't want to say if you're not careful. And there are certain topics that we're meant to cover during the exam. So 2 candidates per topic, and so there are 8 topics, and as tulkus, we're allowed to choose the topic that we're going to prepare for this exam. In my class, there are only I think there are only 4 topics that you actually can choose as a tulku. The rest are reserved for other people, but for the rest of the classmates. But in any case, in my class, that we were 4 tulkus. So that meant, and you have seniority and status, so hierarchical status within the monastery, within tulkus. And I was considered the lowest of the tulkus, of these 4 tulkus. And so since I was the lowest of them, I got the last choice. And so I didn't really have much of a choice, but but I did get one specific topic, and when did the exam, and from what I was told, I did very well on the exam. And then in 1999, when I went to Tibet for the first time, it was then, I was walking through Sarah Monastery in Tibet with a young monk. And we were he was showing me around the monastery, and the disciplinarian came and saw this young monk with 2 Westerners, and he said, "Why aren't you in debate? What's going on?" He said, "Why are you walking around with these Westerners?" And the young monk said, "Oh, this is one of our tulkus. This is one of the tulkus from our regional house. There's monasteries are separated into regional houses." And so he said, "This is one of our tulkus." And he said, "Oh, tulku of who?" And he said, "This is the tulku of Geshe Jetse." He said, "Oh, Geshe Jetse." And he said, "I know Geshe Jetse." He said, "I know Geshe Jetse." And Geshe Jetse was a great debater. He said, "So, did you study?" And I said, "Yes, I've done some studies." He said, "Did you do the Rikchung exam?" And I said, "Yes, I did the Rikchung exam." He said, "What was your topic?" And I said, "This was my topic." And he said, "Oh, just like your predecessor." So it turns out that we both had the same. So maybe that's why I did so well, because I'd already done it before. So there's little, these things happen. There's, I don't believe in coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence. I think everything happens for a reason, and there are connections, there are karmic connections, and in fact, another connection was that everyone that would ever, sort of wondered about my story, about my situation, was curious to know why I spoke when this particular teacher came to Montreal. His name was Kensur Pema Gyaltsen. And why when he came, he wasn't particularly affiliated with Sarah. And there was another geshe who had been living in, another teacher who had been living in Montreal for a long time. And, he was even, in fact, more closely affiliated to the regional house that Geshe Jadze was from, so that I was from in my previous life. And so everyone was curious, well, how come I didn't speak to him? And I spoke when this other teacher came. And once again, when I went to Tibet for the first time in 1999, I was talking with one of my predecessor's former students. And I asked him the question. I said, okay, why do you think I spoke to him and not to anyone else? And he said, well, that's easy. You did your geshe degrees together. So we had undergone the exam to become geshes, which it was the highest exam. The highest type, there are 5 types of geshe degree, and the highest type you called the geshe Haramba. It's basically you have to go to all 3 major Gelugpa monasteries and debate in front of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and anyone can ask you questions. Anyone can from the monastery can come and debate against you, and so I had done this. My predecessor had done this with this other geshe, and they were very close friends. So he came, and that's when my memories sort of started to come out. Michael, you had a question?
I'm not actually asking a question. I think we need to take a break.
Okay.
I need to take a break. On behalf of those who might need to take a break, we need to
Take a break.
And so many people are here who may not know, but this house has 3 bathrooms, one upstairs, one in the basement, one in the back of the kitchen. That's all I got.
So, 3 possibilities.
So, we'll come back here.
Yeah.
Okay. I doubt.
It's a good idea, because I also have to use one of the 3 jewels.
I just got back from vacation.
Where'd you go?
Like through the Nevada desert and Big Sur, down through.
That is a big trip. Those aren't very close